So, in my opinion today, we are asking if it's right to lock down people who refuse to be jabbed. Silkie Carlo is director of the civil liberties group Big Brother Wach. Good morning, Silkie.
Good morning.
What do you reckon? Decent idea?
It's terrible and it's terrifying. It's extreme, it's authoritarian, it's unscientific because, of course, vaccine is very good at protecting you against hospitalization or worse, but they are not protecting people against infection. We can see that by the state that we're in. So I think what's happening in Austria is alarming. It's a stain on the human rights record of Europe, and it's not going to get us any further in terms of the public health situation. Quite the opposite.
Yeah, we don't particularly want to get into a big discussion around vaccine efficacy because that is something we've talked about a lot, although vaccines do reduce transmission rates. They don't entirely prevent infection, but they do reduce transmission rates. We know that. But in terms of this debate around protecting certain people's freedoms by restricting others, there is a valid case there, isn't there? What about the rights, the freedom of other people to be able to go about their business and live their lives in a way that is unrestricted because they've taken the appropriate cautions around vaccinations? Those rights, aren't they being trampled on by those who refuse to be jabbed?
No. But first of all, I think this point about vaccine efficacy is absolutely central to the policy that can't be skimmed over. And it would be good, for example, if people looked at the UK health security agency reports on vaccine efficacy and infection rates, because we are seeing massive infection rates, not just numbers, rates in vaccinated, double vaccinated people. So that is central to the debate. But this kind of swing towards authoritarianism.
I go back to that key point that it does reduce your chances of passing on the virus. That is scientifically proven. So I just want to make that clear.
There's conflicting evidence on it. So it goes both ways. And the fact of the matter is, in the UK, for example, we've got 90% of people who are vaccinated, and still there are high rates of transmission. So I think that, the writing's on the wall. We've got to look at this in the long term. If we are having these authoritarian swings in Europe now, what does this bode for the future? How long is it before the UK follows in the footsteps of Austria? If we're going to follow illogical and unscientific policy. And this does affect everyone, vaccinated or unvaccinated. And I hate the idea of pitting these two groups against each other, because it affects us all if we are living in an unfree and totalitarian kind of society where we have to show our papers. That's what's now happening in Austria. They have a checkpoint society where police can stop anyone in a shop or anywhere and say, show me your medical papers. I really thought we could have learned something from the past about just how dangerous this kind of discriminatory spot checking is.
I think it'd probably be helpful for people to understand where you're coming from on all of this. Are you coming from the point of view of you don't have faith in the vaccines? Are you yourself vaccinated? Where do you stand on that?
I'm pro-vaccination, but we need to understand what vaccines do. And they are about protecting you and yourself and your health. We shouldn't see unvaccinated people as a risk to others. It doesn't even make sense to say that a vaccine protects you from coronavirus, but it doesn't protect you from unvaccinated people who most likely don't have coronavirus. So the enemy here is the virus. It's not each other. It's not unvaccinated.
But you
people.
understand, obviously, if the virus is swirling around, there's more opportunity for it to mutate. If there's more opportunity for it to mutate, it then potentially undermines the vaccine. It puts vulnerable people at risk. So it's not quite as clear cut as you suggest, is it?
But the virus is transmitting regardless of vaccination. And we need to be listening to, we can't just go into this weird twilight zone of wishful thinking. We need to be listening to experts on this, not just politicians, and be realistic about the situation. And also be realistic about the fact that in times of emergency, politicians will seek to have power grabs. And all of this stuff is going to be very hard to undo. It's very hard to step back from a world in which people are carrying papers and showing them on demand to police officers, and also putting their fellow citizens under house arrest because they haven't made a medical decision that politicians have told them to. all of this is dangerous territory.
Yeah, I hear you. And we should say there are all kinds of exemptions in the Austria case. So, for example, unvaccinated people will still be able to go to work with a negative test result. They can do essential shopping and outdoor physical exercise. They can meet their partner or other select individuals, and they can satisfy their basic religious needs. And I'm also aware that I will get countless messages now from people who believe I am pushing the agenda for vaccines against what some people hold the view is, against all reason and logic. So I'm not particularly doing that, but I am challenging you in a debate and a discussion around this whole area, which I know you appreciate. But,
yeah, of course. But it's almost like the alarm bells aren't, it's not enough to say, oh, don't worry, you can still go out to work, and we saw this kind of attitude here when we had lockdown with people going out to do low paid jobs. It's not enough to say that makes you free. I feel like the alarm bells aren't quite ringing here. Millions of people have just been put under house arrest because they haven't complied with a medical demand from their government. That there's not even a scientific case that these people pose a risk to others. It's extraordinary.
You call it a power grab. So I'm curious, what do you think the motivation of governments is in a situation like this, knowing that these kinds of measures can make them deeply unpopular? What do you think is the motivation of the Austrian government or any government imposing these sorts of restrictions?
Well, once you enter a phase of authoritarianism, it doesn't necessarily make a government less popular, these kinds of actions. But the question you've just asked is the million-dollar question. I don't know, and that's why I think it's terrifying, and that's why I think there are millions of people around Europe who are now terrified.
Well, that's why I'm asking. Maybe it's not an authoritarian power grab. Maybe it's an overriding concern for public health. So motivation is quite important to dig into, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But it's not an overriding concern for public health. I think at best, if we're being charitable, it's that the government has completely failed to get a grip on the situation. Bear in mind, we're 2 years into this now. If you can't control the situation at this point, and you have to be entering into a checkpoint society where people have to show their papers to police officers just to live their lives, then clearly something's gone really wrong. And I do think there is a kind of do something attitude from politicians at the moment. We're seeing it here with COVID passes too. Despite the fact that SAGE and all the other evidence says this probably isn't going to make any difference. In fact, it could have harms.
What's the do nothing scenario then in this case?
Well, that's not something we can entertain. I mean, obviously, this is now endemic. It's serious. It poses a risk to the state of our society, but there are far more proportionate, effective and inclusive measures that politicians can be looking at. And in general, I think we need to look at public health measures as what health has always been. It's about compassion. It's about empowering people with choices, especially in the societies we're lucky to live in, where we have well-resourced health systems and we have choices. It's not about policing and punishment and locking people away for making the wrong decision or making the decision at the wrong time. So I think that there is, do nothing is not something I suggest that we entertain at all. But we're seeing far less of the compassion and nurture you expect from a health system, and far more of kind of policing and punishment that you expect from, frankly, a totalitarian society.
Very interesting to hear from you. Thank you, Silkie. Loads of reaction to this, as you might expect this morning. Silkie Carlo is director of the Civil Liberties Group Big Brother Watch.